Some of the most catastrophic decisions in human history were made not by fools, but by those praised as brilliant. Generals with glory in their past, rulers with total control, masterminds with every tool of strategy at their disposal. And still, they fell into the abyss of arrogance. Their miscalculations weren't minor, they sparked wars, collapsed empires, and buried millions. All because they trusted too much, listened too little, and let ego override reason. The battlefield has no mercy for pride dressed up as brilliance. And the most terrifying part? The same fatal mistakes that once shook the world are still being made today in boardrooms, in politics, in our everyday lives. Today, we journey into the minds behind history's greatest military disasters, not to mock the fallen, but to understand how they fell. Because true wisdom comes not from avoiding mistakes, but from recognizing them before they're ours to make. 1. The charge of the Light Brigade. When courage faced a fatal miscalculation. Courage is a virtue, but courage without clarity becomes tragedy. In 1854, during the Crimean War, the British Light Brigade received a misunderstood order: attack a Russian position. What they didn't know? It was a death trap, heavily fortified, surrounded on all sides. What followed was a spectacle of heroic and suicidal bravery. The soldiers rode with honor, but straight into the jaws of destruction, and all of it because of a single failure in communication between generals. Picture it, hundreds of cavalrymen charging down a narrow valley, under a storm of cannon fire and bullets. It was like sending cyclists into an avalanche. Many died as heroes. But what history remembers is the question no one dared to ask at the time. Is it worth obeying without questioning? That answer was written in blood across the valley floor. And now ask yourself, how many times in life do we charge forward just because someone told us to? Because the system expects it? Because we're afraid to ask why? The charge of the Light Brigade became a symbol of blind obedience and a brutal reminder that even decisions wrapped in honor can be fatally wrong when made without full understanding. But if this tragedy was born from blind obedience, the next one is even crueler. It's the story of a genius, blinded not by orders, but by his own brilliance, and defeated by something as simple as the weather. 2. Napoleon invades Russia. The winter that devoured an empire. Ah, Napoleon, one of the greatest military minds in history, no doubt. But even the brightest minds stumble, especially when confidence turns into arrogance. In 1812, Napoleon launched a massive invasion of Russia, an army of over 600,000 men, seemingly unstoppable. But he ignored a detail every Russian peasant knew by heart. The Russian winter shows no mercy. Russia didn't need to defeat Napoleon on the battlefield. It simply had to outlast him and let nature take its course. The Russian strategy was silent and ruthless. Retreat, burn their own cities, destroy supplies. The farther the French advanced, the deeper they sank into an abyss of ice and desperation. Napoleon's Grand Armée began with glory and ended in horror. Less than 100,000 men returned, frozen, starving, broken. But it wasn't just the cold that crushed them. Russia unleashed more than winter. They freed prisoners to create chaos, launched swift attacks with cavalry. And when Napoleon's starving men reached Kaluga, hoping for food and shelter, they were met by fresh, organized Russian forces. The only escape? A retreat through the same scorched path they came in on, now haunted by frostbite, hunger, and ambushes from armed peasants. The Russian winter became legend, and Napoleon was no longer invincible. But if you think learning from failure is enough, think again. Up next, a commander who had every chance to prepare and still built a genius defense, frozen in the past. 3. The Maginot Line, a fortress trapped in time. At first glance, it looked like a masterpiece of strategy, a fortress of reinforced concrete, underground tunnels, massive artillery, state-of-the-art ventilation systems, and impenetrable shield. The famous Maginot Line, built by France between the two world wars, it stood as a monument to brilliant planning of the past. They were so focused on stopping a repeat German invasion, they forgot one simple truth: war evolves, and the enemy learns. When Germany attacked in 1940, they didn't waste time going head-to-head with the Maginot Line. They simply went around it, through Belgium again, with lightning-fast tanks, synchronized airstrikes, and modern tactics. In just a few weeks, Paris had fallen. That billion-dollar wall years in the making became a global symbol of strategic arrogance, protecting yesterday, ignoring tomorrow. The Maginot Line became a metaphor, a warning to anyone trying to build safety without staying adaptable. Yes, security matters, but it's vision, not walls, that truly protect you. And now comes an even more shocking failure, because if there's anything worse than building the wrong defense, it's walking into someone else's land with arrogance, thinking you'll be the one calling the shots. The next story shows how disrespecting another culture can cost you everything. 4. The March to Beijing, when the world underestimated China. Around the year 1900, during the Boxer Rebellion, the Western powers made a bold move: send an international force to crush the Chinese rebels and secure their interests in Beijing. What was supposed to be a display of European supremacy quickly turned into a cultural and strategic quagmire. They expected a swift, clean, and glorious march, but they forgot one crucial detail: this wasn't their land. And underestimating a people on their own soil is a recipe for disaster. The soldiers marched in as if on parade, but what they found were ambushes, fierce resistance, and a landscape that turned against every move they made. Worse yet, Western arrogance blinded them to any chance of dialogue or understanding. It was like breaking into someone's home and expecting to be welcomed as the host. But China, wounded, proud, and enraged, fought back with a force that stunned the world. The conflict dragged on, the cost soared, and the bitterness it sowed still echoes through history. And if you think about it, how many times do we walk into unfamiliar places acting like we know it all, ignoring the unspoken rules, the context, the culture? The march to Beijing became a painful reminder. Disregarding local culture, whether in war, business, or personal relationships, is a direct path to your own downfall. But if you think this kind of mistake belongs to the 19th century, wait until you see what the United States pulled off during the Cold War. A plan straight out of a spy thriller. That spiraled into a very real nightmare. 5. The Bay of Pigs invasion. When everything that could go wrong did. In 1961, the United States backed a group of Cuban exiles in a bold attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro. The plan? A swift, silent, surgical invasion through the Bay of Pigs. On paper, it looked flawless. In reality, it became one of the greatest strategic embarrassments of the 20th century. There was no proper air support. The rebels were poorly trained. And worst of all, the Cuban people didn't rise up as expected. The result? A complete disaster: prisoners, casualties, and an international humiliation. But the real failure wasn't just military. It was a failure of perception. The planners were so convinced of their own vision that they ignored the facts. The popular support Castro still held, the strength of his defense forces, and how the world would see this as yet another act of U.S. interference. The CIA thought it could shape reality to fit its assumptions. Instead, it was swallowed by them. And this story, though more recent, holds a timeless lesson. Trusting guesswork over grounded truth, ignoring the other side's reality, is like building a fortress on quicksand. It may look strong until everything sinks. The Bay of Pigs became a symbol of arrogance disguised as strategy, and left behind an unsettling question. How many times are we still making this same mistake in other arenas of life? And speaking of arrogance, the next mistake? It's practically a masterclass in how not to start a war, a superpower underestimating a people, and getting a lesson that would shake the empire to its core. 6. The Italian invasion of Greece, when underestimating the enemy comes at a high price. Mussolini was hungry for glory. While Hitler stormed through Europe, the Italian leader didn't want to be left behind. So in 1940, he made a bold decision: invade Greece. He thought it would be quick, easy, almost a victory parade, but he had no idea what he was walking into. Greece was no easy target. The terrain was mountainous, the weather unforgiving, and the Greek spirit unbreakable. What was meant to be a swift conquest became a military embarrassment. The Italian forces were poorly equipped, poorly trained, and completely unprepared. Meanwhile, the Greeks fought with grit, strategy, and intimate knowledge of their land. The result? The campaign collapsed. Mussolini's reputation took a serious hit, and Hitler had to step in to clean up the mess. But that delay cost Germany dearly. It pushed back the timeline for invading the Soviet Union, and in a twist of fate, helped seal the Nazis' doom on the Eastern Front. All of it sparked by sheer arrogance. And here lies the lesson: never underestimate those who are fighting for their home. In life, many defeats don't come from the strength of the opponent, but from the weight of our own pride. The invasion of Greece was a classic stumble, the kind that happens when ambition isn't backed by real preparation. But not all failures happen on land. Up next, a mistake that took to the skies, to the seas, and hit straight at the heart. A bold attack that looked brilliant on paper, but awakened a sleeping giant. 7. Pearl Harbor, a brilliant strike with fatal consequences. Pearl Harbor, 1941. Japan aimed to strike hard and fast, crippling the United States Navy and securing dominance in the Pacific. And in a way, they succeeded. Japanese bombers rained fire on the American naval base in Hawaii, destroying ships, decimating aircraft, taking lives in a single devastating blow. But here's the twist. Instead of paralyzing the United States, they awakened a sleeping giant. The American response was swift, ruthless, unrelenting. What was meant to be a decisive advantage ended up sealing Japan's defeat. The real mistake wasn't just military, it was psychological. Japan understood America's firepower, but completely misread its heart. A nation divided on entering the war came together in a single heartbeat. President Roosevelt called it a day that will live in infamy. The next day, the U.S. declared war, and from that moment on, Japan wasn't just fighting for territory. It was facing the full force of the world's greatest industrial power. Pearl Harbor became a case study in miscalculation, a flawlessly executed attack driven by a deeply flawed assumption. And that brings us to one of the most powerful lessons in military history. Never aim only at what your enemy has. Understand who they are. Resilience, emotion, identity. Underestimate them, and you won't just lose the battle. You'll ignite a force you can't contain. When the smoke cleared, the Allies found themselves cornered. And what came next was one of the most daring escapes in military history. Heroic, yes, but one that never should have been necessary. 8. The British retreat from Dunkirk, a heroic escape that should never have been needed. You've probably heard of the miracle of Dunkirk. Thousands of British and Allied soldiers trapped on the beaches of France, surrounded by German forces, waiting for a rescue that seemed impossible. And against all odds, the rescue came. Warships, civilian boats, anything that could float crossed the channel and brought them home. The operation was a stunning success. But let's face the truth. It only happened because of a massive strategic failure. The British had underestimated the speed and ferocity of the German blitzkrieg. They placed their trust in fragile defenses and were swiftly driven back all the way to the sea. Even with Hitler hesitating to deliver the final blow, whether out of arrogance, poor judgment, or indecision. The situation was critical. The evacuation saved hundreds of thousands of lives, but it also exposed a harsh reality. When preparation fails, when communication breaks down, when overconfidence blinds leadership, even the most powerful forces can become prey. Dunkirk became a symbol of resilience, but also a warning. Sometimes survival feels like victory, but only because the blunder before it nearly cost everything. And now, ask yourself, how often do we only act when we're already cornered? How often do we wait for chaos to knock before we even look for a way out? The next failure we'll explore carries that same sense of desperation, but this time it's amplified by pure megalomania. Because not all disasters come from superpowers. Sometimes a catastrophe is born from the ego of a single man, and what he lost wasn't just a battle. It was his entire army. 9. Custer's last stand, when ego drowns out logic. The year was 1876. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer wanted his moment of glory. Leading just over 200 men, he charged into an indigenous encampment, one that held thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. He ignored warnings, underestimated his enemy, and believed he could win. The result? A massacre. Not a single man from his detachment survived. Custer became the face of one of the greatest blunders in U.S. military history. He could have waited for reinforcements. He could have scouted properly. But instead, he chose impulsive heroism. What he imagined as a path to greatness became a tragic, avoidable end. And here's the strange part. Even today, many romanticize it as a heroic last stand. But in truth, it was pure recklessness. To lead without listening, to charge without understanding, to trust without calculating. That was the true battlefield Custer lost on. And here's the deeper reflection. How often do we find ourselves in positions of leadership, at work, at home, in life, and out of pride, ignore advice, signs, and facts? Custer's failure is more familiar than we'd like to admit, because sometimes the greatest enemy isn't out there. It's within. And now for our final story. A lesson even deeper, from a war so long, so costly, and so misunderstood, that even the most powerful nation on earth couldn't grasp the most basic truth about its enemy. 10. The Vietnam War. When a superpower failed to understand its enemy. The Vietnam War stands as a textbook case of how not to fight a war. The United States entered the conflict with overwhelming confidence, trusting in its technological, military, and economic superiority, helicopters, napalm, cutting-edge weapons. And yet, they lost, but not on the battlefield. The defeat was moral, psychological, political, because they never truly understood what they were up against. A people willing to fight for their land at any cost. To America, Vietnam was just another Cold War chessboard, but to the Vietnamese, it was life or death. They knew the terrain, they had local support, they fought with guerrilla tactics, ambushes, underground tunnels, and endless patience. While the U.S. measured success in body counts and rapid victories, the Vietnamese played the long game, and they won. The true failure? Pride. The belief that brute force could solve everything. But force without understanding is just noise. And noise doesn't build peace. The Vietnam War left scars. On America, on Vietnam, on the world. And it teaches us, in no uncertain terms, ignoring a people's culture, history, and will may be the single dumbest decision anyone can make. History doesn't whisper, it warns. And if we don't learn from it, we're bound to repeat the same mistakes, just with new flags. If this video made you think, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. There's more to learn and much more to question.